Welcome everyone to this episode of Viruk and Jeb Have Fun with Rockets. And today we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to do a challenge, and that challenge involves this Rocamax X232 fuel tank. Now, one of my viewers, one of the fellow YouTubers for KSP, had a challenge to get one of these tanks into orbit with a full load of liquid fuel. No oxidizer, just liquid fuel. And I gave him a few hints and tips, but I thought I ought to put my money where my mouth was and actually try it for myself. So here goes. Let's start with a new vehicle, so let's not save this one, and we're going to begin with one of the small Probodyne cores. Now you'll see on the left there I have all the parts. This in fact is a sandbox game, not a career mode game, but I am going to try and use all of the early or entry level parts. So to begin with, we're going to use a reaction wheel. I'm going to try and stick to the parts that Aylwick used in his attempt to complete this challenge. I'm also going to use the scriptable control system. Now that is a little bit of a cheat, but given that he had access to Mech Jeb, I'm going to use KOS instead, and since I wrote all the scripts for it, I think that's only fair. Now next we're going to have to get ourselves an adapter. We're going to use the Rocamax brand adapter, and that's what we're going to add our tank to. So let's go and find our grey tank. There we go, that's the Rocamax X200. Now the X200 holds a total of 1440 in fuel, and that was just about what Aylwick needed to complete his challenge. But we don't need the oxidizer, so we'll take that out, and we'll also lock the tanks so that no fuel can be drained from those tanks. So we must have 1440 fuel left in the tank when we arrive in orbit. So that's the tanks locked, but of course if we're going to maneuver in orbit, we'll need another tank, so we'll use the 16 tank, the Dash 16 tank, and my favourite manoeuvring engine for this sort of thing is down here, the REL10 Poodle engine. So let's stack that on the bottom, and so that's going to be our orbital stage. As usual, we start from the top back, so from orbit back. Now, as a final part of the challenge, it wasn't just to get the tank into orbit, but we needed to have enough fuel remaining to dock. So we're going to have quite a bit of fuel left in this bottom stage, and we're also going to have to be able to dock. So that's the next step. Let's have a look at docking. So we're going to put a clampatron on the top. So let's get we'll get the standard clampatron, which is the one I prefer to use, and we'll stack that there on the top. Let's just do Alt-click. There we go. So we've now got our clampatron attached there at the top. And next, I think we need to get on some RCS. So let's go and get the tiny little RCS tanks. They're little globe RCS tanks. Let's go and have a find of where they are. There we go. The Stratus V roundified monopropellant tanks. So we're going to squeeze them in here at the top, and I think we'll have 6 to match the number of sides that were on the Probodyne core. So that gives us our docking fuel, but clearly we need some docking thrusters, and they're under command and control, and we're going to use the standard little 4-way thruster blocks. Now for the moment we're only going to have 4, so let's just get that down to 4, and I'm just going to chuck them onto the craft. So we'll have 4 at the top and 4 down here at the bottom, so that should be 4. Now it looks like I've got 3 there, so let's just change that to 4. Now most people would just leave it at that. That should be around about correct. However, we do have a mod to help us. We have the RCS build aid, and the RCS build aid gives you this nice little red circle which tells you the direction of rotation when you fire your thrusters for, in this case, translation. And we're going to translate right, but because of the positioning of our thrusters, we're actually going to have a little bit of torque rotating us in this direction. In other words, this is going to be levered over in this direction, and it's going to be a torque, as you can see here, of 4.24 kilonewtons. So that's actually quite a big difference. And if we grab hold of our thrusters, you can see how the circle is increasing and decreasing in size as we move our thruster blocks. And so we can use the RCS build aid to position our thruster blocks to minimize this rotational torque. So we can do that at the bottom. We can't move them any further at the bottom. So let's try moving them here at the top here. So let's move them as far down as we can. Now, it might be a good idea if we complete the rest of our vehicle before we finish off adjusting that, because there might be additional fuel or additional components, for example batteries and power, that we might want to add to this vehicle in order to change the way it is being twisted or turned by the thruster block. So let's just finish that off, and then we'll do a final adjustment. We're going to add some batteries. Now, Aylwick didn't do that, but I think we are probably going to need some batteries if we find ourselves on the dark side. And we're also going to use some voltaic panels, our static voltaic panels. So let's just have a nice load of those. We'll have 8 of those positioned here. So that should be everything we need. So we should now be able to adjust the position of our thruster blocks to take account. I've got 8 of them now. So let's just go back down to 4 and see how we can position these blocks to minimize our total translation. So if we change these down as far as we can go, so that's down to 2.8. Let's bring them down just a little further. There we go. We can get it down to 0.02. So we now have perfectly positioned thruster blocks, giving us just a tiny amount of torque. Now, of course, that assumes that this tank stays as full as it does, which of course we've locked it to not drain. We've also removed all the oxidizer, but we can also expect to have lost a little bit of fuel from this bottom stage as part of our maneuvering. So let's simulate that by removing, let's say, half of it. And now you can see we have a little bit more torque, but this time in the opposite direction. We're now actually twisting the other way. So let's just finalize the adjustment of our blocks and just see if we can minimize that. So there we go. We've got 0.98, 0.8, and it's just starting to go back up again. So let's get it down as small as we can, which is about there. So that's a reasonable compromise. So that should balance our craft both when this is full and when it's half empty or when it's empty. So it should be reasonably stable, and we do have the control wheel here at the top, the advanced inline stabilizer, to compensate for any rotation. Now, of course, we're translating right, and we can change the direction of translation to left, up and down, but because our vehicle is entirely symmetrical from that perspective, up, down, left and right is not going to make any difference to the balance of our craft, because it isn't symmetrical, or there's no change in symmetry between left and right, for example. It's exactly the same. So whilst you can change the direction, this is mainly used for vehicles that perhaps are non-symmetrical left and right, for example, so that you can balance your thrusters according to that. Now, you can also change the markers that you can see. So for example, you can change whether you're displaying the centre of mass, the yellow centre of mass that you're familiar with, the dry centre of mass, which is this red globe, and there's also an average centre of mass, which is sort of an orange globe, and that's a way of you testing out your positioning of your thrusters as fuel is drained from your vehicle. So you may find that particularly helpful. I find displaying both the average and displaying the average not that helpful, but displaying both the centre of mass and the dry centre of mass, so that as you change the amount of fuel, you can see how your centre of mass is going to change, and where your dry centre of mass would be if you were completely dry. So that's something you may find very, very useful. So with that said, we now have to get this vehicle into space. So we need to build our launch stage, so we can forget about the RCS build aid, because we know our centre of mass will now be changing considerably as we add our launch stage. So let's go and get ourselves a decoupler. So you can either browse to it, or you can search for it with the little quick search tool, which again is another add-on. So let's go and get our decouplers. There's the large Rocamax brand decoupler. We'll chuck that on the bottom. We'll go and get another one of our grey tanks. So where's our grey tank? Not under structural. Grey tanks is here on the second page. There we go. So we're going to put one of those there on the bottom. And finally, now Aylwick had access to a mainsail engine as part of an unrelated contract, but we're going to stick to skippers. They're quite an early launch engine, so this is going to form the basis of our launch stage. Now for that we're going to use the Kerbin Engineer Redux tool in order to determine the approximate amount of delta V we need. Now in order to get into orbit, if you go and look at your cheat sheets, which you'll find around the internet, if you get one of the updated cheat sheets, there's an awful lot for the earlier versions of KSB, but the updated ones tell you need about 3,300 delta V to get into a stable 80 kilometer orbit. So that's what we're aiming for. So we're going to add next, we're not going to add solid rocket boosters. You could do solid rocket boosters, but we're going to add some asparagus staged sections, and we're going to do that using the TT7 radial decouplers. We're going to use just two, so we're going to clip those there on the bottom, and then we're going to build up 2 orange tanks worth of these X232s. So let's plonk these on the bottom. We're going to use those in, as I say, the asparagus staged mode. And again, we're going to use them with the skipper engine. So let's stack those there on the bottom. We're going to have to sort out our staging as well. So let's get that sorted out now, at least to begin with. And next we need to do our asparagus staging, and for that you need your external fuel duct. So let's grab that. And we're going to have the fuel ducts positioned so that fuel comes from the outside to the inside. So let's do that. And so that is our launch stage, at least structurally sound, and we have 3,649 delta V, which is plenty to do the manoeuvres we're about to do. We haven't quite finished yet, so again, like the RCS, we are going to have to finish off our build before we know exactly what we have. So let's do that now, and to do that I'm going to use not this FLA5 adapter. I'm going to use the other adapter, the adapter that you see upside down. So let's look for adapters, and so it's this, the Rocamax brand adapter, and I'm going to use that on the top here just to add a smidgen of aerodynamic effect. Now you could use fairings to sort of create a nose cone, but they are actually quite heavy. And I don't know that it's going to make an awful lot of difference to our craft, so we will use the FL5 adapters. And I'm also using stage recovery, so we need some chutes So let's get some of these MK16XL parachutes and just add those to the top. And then what will happen is when this section is staged, the parachutes will open, but we've got to be very careful about when they open so they don't rip off. And the default, if you read the wiki, is to set the minimum air pressure to about 0.5, and that should be about right. So 0.49, 0.5, that should be about right for them to open a little bit above the ground, but enough to slow their descent, and then chute recovery will take care of the rest. So that's chute recovery sorted out. But one of the other things that Aylwick had problems with was a lack of space tape. So we need the strut, the EAS4 strut connector. And we're going to connect that here and just make sure our rocket is not too floppy. That's attached to the parachute, which we don't want. We want it attached here to the side of the external tanks. So that is those tanks now secured. In order to keep us on the straight and narrow, we need to get some fins, and the fins we're going to get are the ones I prefer using, which are the AVR8 winglets, which actually have active control. They actually move to help you steer. So we'll have 4 of those. I think those are positioned correctly. Yeah, that looks fine. So that is our challenge craft. We have our docking port at the top, so we can do the docking. We have plenty of monopropellant RCS fuel. We have some panels to charge our batteries, and of course we have our thrusters, which we positioned using the RCS build aid in order to make sure our stage that's here, this stage here, is stable when being docked. We then built our launch stage, which is this asparagus staged section just here, with the equivalent of 2 orange tanks on the outside feeding to the center tank, and then beneath the 3 tanks at the bottom here we have 3 I think it's 15 Skipper liquid fuel engines. Now all we need to do is to double check our staging. So as part of stage recovery we need to fire the parachutes, or at least trigger the parachutes as the external tanks are jettisoned. We also need to make sure this thing will stand up will actually stand up on the pad. So let's go and get some launch stability enhancers. We'll put 2 that side and we'll put 2 this side. Just make sure they are in the right stage. So I think the A1 challenge launch vehicle, so let's call this the A1, we'll call this the A1, I think is almost ready to go. The last thing we need to do, which is particular to my configuration, is just to increase the KOS disk space so that we have plenty of disk space for loading our KOS script. So let's just save that. Now there is one last thing that I'd like to point out about this vehicle, and that's actually to point out something about the Kerbin Engineer Redux and how it works. Now at the moment it's defaulting to displaying just the compact settings, but you can press the compact button and get it to display all of the available figures that it can compute, so mass, cost, ISP and so on. And you can also change the body around which the craft is being flown, and therefore the calculations will update accordingly. But that's not specifically the one I wanted to highlight. So it defaults to being around Kerbin, which is obviously where we are. But I actually wanted to look particularly at the Delta V setting. We'll go back to the compact view to make that a little easier to see. And it's particularly, I want to focus on Delta V. And it's the Delta V in the atmosphere. So in Kerbin's atmosphere, we have 3,595 delta V, and that assumes it's an atmosphere for the entire flight of the craft, which isn't true. Now you can press the atmosphere button and it will recompute the delta V settings without the atmospheric effects, and you can see we have 5,149 delta V. In the atmosphere it's 3,500. Out of the atmosphere it would be 5,000. So our actual delta V probably lies somewhere in between. So although this figure might seem rather low, it's probably okay. But let's go and test that, shall we? I'll see you out on the launch pad. Well, it's the usual bright and calm day as always here at KSC. We can see our launch vehicle here. We can also check out the resource panel, the alternate resource panel, another mod that I have loaded. It's showing our total amount of liquid fuel, and obviously we have removed some oxidizer from it, hence the slight gap there at the top. But that's not what you came here to see. This is not what the press and the media are here to see. So let's get cracking. Let's get up our KOS window. Let's run our initialization script. And that will load our ascend and utility scripts into memory. So let's now run our ascend 8 script, version 8 of our script. It's going to have an inclination of 0 and a default target apoapsis of 100 kilometers, which was the target that Aylwick was after. So let's see how we go. Now the script, as I say, was cobbled together by myself, and obviously Jeb had a helping hand, obviously. It will go on full throttle for the first 1,000 meters or so, and it will then start to use a PID controller to control the total throttle. The target total throttle displayed up here will be set such that the target thrust to weight ratio remains at about 2, and this is the actual thrust to weight ratio of our craft. As you can see, it's increasing as we burn fuel, so it's just about up to 2. There we go. So the PID controller is starting to reduce the throttle, so you can see the throttle setting here, and you can also see the throttle slowly reducing here. The idea is we don't go too fast, nor do we go too slow, because too fast would create a lot of atmospheric drag, too slow would waste fuel getting into orbit. So this is hopefully the optimal burn ratio. Now, as for my gravity turn, the gravity turn computed is simply a linear function of atmosphere between vertically upright on the launch pad to 30 degrees turn as we go up in height. So we can see our target altitude here is 100 kilometers. We can see our current pitch, that will go down to 30, and at which point we will then assume we are above the majority of the atmosphere and just go full throttle. So let's just watch that happen. There we go. So we are now at full throttle, powering our way to our final apoapsis. There go our grey tanks, and although the parachutes triggered, notice they didn't open because chute recovery will manage the recovery of those tanks and fire the parachutes at a 0.5 our atmosphere, which is considerably behind us in the atmosphere. So hopefully we should see some messages pop up in the top right corner very soon. We're reaching our final apoapsis now, so our engine has cut out. We still have about 2/3 of our fuel, which is plenty to run our circularization script. And this script will give us a node at our apoapsis and will also circularize to that height. So let's just swing ourselves around, get ourselves pre-aligned, because one of the things Chaos doesn't do very well is align to a marker. So let's just do that in advance. There we go. The program has ended. The circularization node has been computed. So let's run that node again using a node execution script. This will predict the total estimated burn is 61 seconds. And we will lock to our alignment at 91 seconds. So that has just passed. So we will now complete our burn on 31. So that's approximately half before and half after our node. So we've still got about 30 odd seconds to go. So let's just use time warp to accelerate our way towards our node. So there we go, 57. So let's just put 1 unit of time warp in and then 1 unit of time warp out. So there goes our engine. So we are now circularizing. We still have plenty of fuel in this section. We're going to be using another 850 units of fuel, which is not quite enough fuel in this stage to complete the circularization. So let's just see how well we do. We've got about 650 units of Delta V still to expend, but we've only got 500 left, so we'll have just a little bit of fuel used out of this tank here. But let's just see how that goes. We're about halfway through our burn. 330 units still to go, so it's about 2/3 of the way. And we're almost out of fuel in this section. Now don't worry too much about that explosion. It's a feature, let's call it a feature of the recent heating changes that decouplers will explode on heating very, very easily. But there we are now in orbit. We have a full tank of liquid fuel, so that's just over 1,400 units of fuel, which I think was the amount that had to be delivered, so we got 40 units spare. We have almost an entire tank of liquid fuel and oxidizer to do our maneuvering, and if we go into map mode, you can see that we have a pretty circular orbit, 105 and 95. Not perfect, the script isn't perfect, and obviously you as a much better pilot than I could probably do a lot better than that. But we've completed the challenge. We have our grey tank full of liquid fuel in orbit. All that would remain is to do your manoeuvring and docking to wherever your station is. In this case, it was a station in a 100-kilometre orbit. So I hope you found that little tutorial on getting a tank of fuel into orbit useful. You found a little introduction to some mods useful. You'll like and subscribe and come back to view some of my other videos very soon. Oh, and one last thing. We did get our stage recovery messages, so let's just have a look at those. We've got 3 in total, and I'm going to deal with the last one first, and there's a good reason for that. I'll show you that in a minute. The stage recovery mod will attempt to recover any modules that had parachutes or could potentially have had a powered landing. You get a lot of information around what was recovered, the total amount of funds that could have been recovered, bearing in mind that you will lose some percentage of your recovery if it lands a long way from the KSC, and that's normal part of KSC recovery mechanics. And at the bottom here you get a list of parts and how much you recovered for each of those parts. So you can see we've actually saved quite a considerable proportion of our funds. We got a total funds recovered of 7,800 out of a possible 10,000. So that's actually quite a lot. So that was for one of the asparagus stages. So that's that one. We can also look at the other asparagus staged section. That was similarly good on recovery funds. So we only lost about 2,500 in funds in total. So that was an excellent recovery. But the central section, the central part of our stage was not recovered. because it crash landed. We didn't fit any parachutes to that central stage, nor was there any probe core or indeed any fuel left in that section for stage recovery to attempt a powered landing, and that's what this message is describing here. So if you're interested in saving a little bit of money and you want to try and improve the funding of your space program in KSP, stage recovery, an excellent mod. So, with that said, I'd like to thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.